Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Since the coming to power of the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf government last year, economy has been a main concern. Both the Prime Minister Imran Khan as well as Finance Minister Asad Umar have been sounding alarm bells. The PM's motif in most speeches at home and abroad has been to hold corruption and corrupt practices accountable for everything that is wrong and has been wrong with the country's economy. The Finance Minister has been more nuanced in his assessment of the structural problems that beset the economy, but so far has not really been able to get a grip on things. The balance of payments problem has had the government running around to seek some reprieve from friendly countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, and even Qatar. The idea was to get as much money in the coffers as possible before going to the IMF. On Wednesday, the Finance Minister announced taking some measures, a speech that has been dubbed as a mini budget. The debate on tax cut has got the opinion divided, with critics wondering whether the government has the fiscal space to give tax relief, even those sympathetic to the government say the measures provided for agriculture, SMEs and exporters are in the right direction, but not enough. They believe that if tax policy is to be implemented by the same FBR administration, the results will remain the same. Another argument is that there's not much effort in this mini budget to reduce the size of the government expenditures. According to PTI manifesto, a number of ministries and their departments had to be slashed and the workforce rationalized. That hasn't happened. Also, if the government is now cutting back on PSDP projects, what is the future plan for increasing development spending? Of course, there are a number of other questions that have been raised constantly with reference to all the governments. What are the structural problems? How to address them? Why are we caught in a cycle that leads us constantly back to balance of payments crises and inevitably to the IMF? Are we in a full-blown economic crisis? To discuss all this, we have Dr. Ijaz Nabi, who is a former World Bank economist, former Dean, Lahore University of Management Sciences and Head of International Growth Center, and Mr. Savel Hussain with us, an economist and CEO of Syed Engineers. And during the course of the program, we'll also try and see if we can get the view from Dr. Miftah Ismail, a former finance minister, and perhaps Dr. Salman Shah also. But let me kick off with Dr. Ejaz Nabi here. Dr. Nabi, starting with what happened yesterday in terms of the package that the finance minister has announced, but then moving on to something more broad in terms of the structural reforms that we constantly talk about. And perhaps you could kick off with whether this is the first such crisis, and if it is not, then why do these crises recur? Are we in a full-blown economic emergency?
Okay, thank you, Ejaz. Look, I think as far as the budget speech yesterday is concerned, that's one step towards the objectives of both stabilization as well as reorienting the economy. We've become a highly import-dependent, consumption-oriented economy, which cannot be sustained. So that fundamental shift has to take place. And yesterday's speech was one step towards that. But I think what is important is to focus on the larger question, which you have articulated quite well, which is that why do these crises recur? Why are we so crisis prone? And I'm afraid the answer to that requires us to take a longer view of how the economy has shaped up in the last 20 years. And I'm not going to go through all of the last 20 years. But I think it'll be good for us to remind ourselves that, General Musharraf, when he left after a burst of growth, he left the economy in tatters. The PPP received an economy which was in terrible shape. They had to go, a balance of payments crisis, they had to go to the IMF, they had to tighten the belt. Things improved somewhat, the election cycle happened, they expanded, and the energy crisis was never really adequately addressed. And the Muslim League government inherited a seat which was, again, faced with severe balance of payments crisis.
Dr. Nabi, let me hold you there. Since you have taken us back, here's my question. Considering that for purely geopolitical reasons, the Musharraf regime did get a lot of reprieve and it had the fiscal space. in which to do the structural reforms. But apparently that did not happen. So my question really is, when we do have the fiscal space, we don't do this, and then obviously we are in a bind, and then we just do not have the fiscal space to do the structural reforms.
Right. Now, the fiscal space that we create, and I was going to conclude that PML, the Nawaz Sharif government, when it left, it also bequeathed a balance of payments crisis to the next government that came in power. So it's a perpetual cycle. And the question then is, why does this cycle recur? And why we do not create the fiscal space to, A, both get out of the crisis, and secondly, to reorient the economy. And that's a deeper question, because the fiscal space that's created in the short run is created through external financing. As soon as external financing disappears, because we haven't got our domestic tax structures and tax expenditures in order, we are back to the crisis, to the fiscal crisis.
Okay, I'm going to get back to this tax thing because, as you know, some economists, notably yours and mine, mutual friend Dr. Nadeemul Haq, has also a perspective on taxation. But let me pull in Savail Hussain here. Savail, as an economist and also as an entrepreneur and an exporter, give me a quick view of what happened yesterday in terms of, good or bad. And then also give me some sense of why. Is it too costly for us? Are we institutionally weak and therefore simply cannot go for the structural reforms that we need to?
Well, what has happened yesterday is that a number of relief measures have been given. Some of them are good in the sense that they will help with capital formation. For instance, the tax on retained earnings, which were basically undistributed profits, that has been done away with. Similarly, intercompany dividends, which were being taxed, that has been done away with. On some raw materials, industrial raw materials like plastics, polypropylene, etc., they've reduced the customs duty, so that will actually, kind of help people who are producing things here. But the larger worry for me, just looking at the numbers, is that given that we have these twin, balance, both the fiscal deficit as well as the balance of payments on the current account side deficit, I don't see any real revenue measures happening. And in fact, what has happened is that in the last 6 months, the Federal Board of Revenue has missed their tax collection target by about 175 billion.
Tax collection targets that are usually considered as already bloated and inflated.
But let me come back. But you see, what has happened here is that we've had a devaluation of about 13% in the last 3 months. Now that automatically adds to your revenue. Why? Because 55% of FBR revenue is collected at the ports. So that's customs duty. So without doing very much, revenues were supposed to go up by about 70 billion. Instead, we've seen a net decrease of 175 billion. Right?
Okay, so hold on.
So if you project this forward for another 6 months.
So here's my question. From your response, then you give tax relief when you already have a shortfall. So,
yes. My concern is that we will end the year with a substantial fiscal deficit at the federal level, and then one can hope that the provinces come up with a very large surplus, at least 350 billion or so. It's only then that we will be able to, possibly even maintain the budget deficit that we did last year, which was 6.6%. But there is a risk that it could be higher. So that's one point. Of course, down the road, if there is if there's more devaluation down the road, then that can perhaps, pad some of this shortfall, or if the FBR is able to kind of get their act together and collect more tax. But ultimately, I think what it'll come down to is what the provinces do, number one. Number two, why is the fiscal deficit important? Why do we throw this number around? There is an intimate relationship between the fiscal deficit and your current account deficit. So one feeds into the other.
Okay.
So that is the concern. The fundamental concern right now for us is that we are simply not producing enough at home and selling enough abroad. That is what is driving the current account deficit, and that is what the real problem is.
Real problem. I'm happy you mentioned that, because I have this article in front of me by Khurram Hussain, and he's just giving three examples. One of the circular debt, and obviously the narrow tax to GDP base, and what he calls the scourge of the trade deficit. And then, of course, he goes on to talk about we were exporting cotton back in the 80s, and we're still exporting cotton. We're not looking at the IT industry. We're not diversifying, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy you brought up that question. I will come back to you, because I know that you're pretty heavy on new institutional economics and institutions, but let me get back to Dr. Nabi here. Dr. Nabi, you have also been advising the governments. Give me a sense of how much the governments are receptive to good advice, and are there any entrenched interests or vested interests, or just simple past dependence that we see in organizations where people just don't want to break the template, they want to just keep doing more of the same?
Look, Pakistan's economic problems are not very complex, at least not technically complex. Technically complex problems happen in countries where the crises are private sector generated crises, because that very quickly translates into a banking sector crisis, and banking sector crises are very difficult to work out. It takes a long time.
What we saw in the US?
The US, the East Asian financial crisis that happened a couple of decades ago. And therefore, the two main balances that was mentioned earlier, that were mentioned earlier by Suhail, they come into play. The fiscal deficit drives the current account deficit, and the current account deficit very quickly turns into a balance of payments crisis. And if you don't have adequate reserves, you have to go from pillar to post to stabilize the economy. It's a very simple, straightforward crisis. We know how to deal with it. Therefore, advice is easy to give. The difficulty is that we've got some very powerful stakeholders, some very powerful consumption lobbies, import lobbies. When your large manufacturers start putting up shopping malls, you've got to worry, because they are diverting investment and resources away from manufacturing and exports into consumption, shopping malls and consumption. Now, of course, at some stage of development, all of these are extremely important. But if this is happening at a time when your exports are stagnant, when the share of manufacturing in the GDP is declining, you've got serious issues that you have to deal with. So advice is given and advice is received, but the politics of implementing that advice is very difficult.
So let me restate what you're saying and correct me if I've misunderstood you. So there's a technical side of things, which in some ways is also Econ 101, and that advice is there, people understand what the problem is. But thereafter, there are political issues, there's lack of administrative will, there are vested interests, and therefore that advice is not fully heeded. But in that case, if I understood you correctly, my next question would be, there is something called enlightened self-interest, which is that even the vested interest, if the size of the cake increases, then the share of the pie will also increase. Perhaps that could be one way of getting the vested interest to get interested in structural reforms?
Yes, of course. The problem, of course, is that when you're caught up in an election cycle, you do the hard work for the first couple of years, sometimes 3 years. Then you need to start expanding rapidly if you are to have any chance of winning the next election. And so far what we've seen is government after government go that route. Now, of course, none of the governments has been helped by this pattern. So hopefully sense will eventually come that this pattern doesn't really work. Look, Ijaz, this is now a very deep problem. There will be very, very harsh times. We will need to go through 2 or 3 years of severe belt tightening. We will have to start paying our taxes. We'll have to cut back expenditures, especially, I mean, look, if utilities such as, electricity delivering companies, if they run at losses, nobody's going to invest in electricity. And therefore, you'll have a major crisis brewing into a full-blown crisis, energy-related down the road. We cannot run these utilities as they run at losses.
So once again, although, the conventional sort of talk about the energy problem is, oh, we're not generating enough. But what you're saying, and what others who understand this normally say, is that it's essentially a governance problem, in the energy sector. Is that correct?
If the current balance sheets of utility companies are to be believed, every dollar of electricity that you generate results in 20 cents of fiscal deficit. So if you expand the supply of energy, supply of electricity, all you're doing is adding to the fiscal deficit. So you've got to fix that first. These are federal utilities. You've got provincial utilities. What business is there for LDA to be receiving a government subsidy? LDA is rich, given how the real estate sector has boomed in Pakistan. Why should Vasa and similar organizations in other large cities need subsidies? So all of this really has to be addressed. Without addressing that, there is no manna from heaven anymore. We have to take our problems, address them, go through the hardship of making these adjustments. The hardship would not last forever. Most countries who've gone through such restructuring, they have had to deal with it for 2 years, 3 years at the outset, and then things begin to improve. But we've got to take the harsh steps.
I absolutely agree with you, and also thank you for very subtly taking the discussion, sort of moving it from pure economics to political economy and issues of local governance and the rest of it. But Sabel Hussain, at that point, since I'm going to come back to what I said about your love for the new institutional economics. Is this an institutional problem? There are no rules of the game. What is the issue here?
Look, the fundamental issue, which has rightly been pointed out, is that technically right now it's a very simple problem. That you cut down your fiscal deficit, you do your belt tightening, that'll actually go and feed into your current account deficit, it'll reduce that and you'll be okay. But the basic problem, which you alluded to in the beginning, is that Pakistan goes through these boom and bust cycles. And what is happening is that now, every time we hit 4% of growth, we start running into a balance of payments problem. And that is always followed by retrenchment, belt tightening, call it what you will, for about 2 years, and then it happens again. Now, Pakistan has to grow at over 7%. Not only because it has to absorb about 2 million new entrants into the labor market.
And not just for a year or 2 years, but over the next 10, 15 years.
Exactly. So you need to be growing at 7 to 8%. Your neighbors are doing that. The Chinese have been doing it for 25 years. The Indians have been doing it for 15 years. So we have to, so what we are in now, and there is a strong case to be made, that Pakistan is in a balance of payments growth trap. And once you start unpacking that, that is, what I mentioned, that we are simply not producing enough at home and selling more abroad. And why is that? Why are entrepreneurs who were previously manufacturers, why are they going into shopping malls, for instance, or real estate?
What Dr. Nabi also pointed.
Exactly. That's what I'm taking it forward from that point. And this is where we come to what we call institutions or institutional economics. And that is about how you align incentives.
Okay, right? Can I ask you to hold for a while, because our former finance minister, Dr. Miftah Ismail, who is in fact traveling, is also with us. Dr. Ismail, thank you so much. What's the takeaway from the finance minister's talk yesterday?
I'm still trying to digest all the reasons why this was done. I mean, the biggest beneficiaries of his mini budget were non-filers who are now allowed to buy cars. This is something our finance minister tried to do 3 months ago in his first mini budget, and his plans were thwarted by the assembly. But he's again put this as a proposal now, so that non-taxpayers can also buy cars. This is obviously going to also help the car companies. He's also put higher duties on imported cars, higher than 1800 cc, which means that the price of cars will go up in Pakistan, domestically manufactured. So that's also going to benefit those car companies. So the benefits that he's given are basically been given to large companies so that stock market moves. He's really not thought about the middle class or the working class or the salaried class people, where he could have helped them with some incentives or subsidies, whether it comes to high prices of food or other things. And very, very curiously, the government has now amended the income tax ordinance and is now allowing that even if you had a property outside Pakistan and if you get caught, even if you have never declared, but if you get caught, there would be no penalties, and it can just be an amended assessment order. So this sort of is...
No, hold on. How does that square with the running motif of the Prime Minister, which is that everything that is wrong with the economy is essentially about corruption and corrupt practices?
This is why I'm saying that it's taking me time to digest this, because this is contrary to his rhetoric over the last decade, really. So right now what you've done is that, people who have properties outside Pakistan, they may be of ill-gotten wealth, they may not be, for all I know, but who have never declared their properties in Pakistan and never do declare, and then if they are caught, there's again no penalty really, and just that it will be an amended assessment order. So that's kind of strange.
Okay. Thank you. That was Dr. Miftah Ismail talking to us, giving us his impression of what has happened yesterday. Let's go back to what you were talking about.
So the fundamental problem of why we actually run into consistently we run into, a current account and then a balance of payments crisis, we were talking about that. And my point was that we need to unpack this a little. It's the incentive structure that, that exists in the economy which will determine whether people go or entrepreneurs go into productive activity or whether they go into redistributive activity or non-productive activity. So we were discussing the example, for instance, of why manufacturers are opening shopping malls, and actually manufacturing as a share of GDP is going down. And now that is where we need to focus. And I think a large debate needs to be had on that. And this is a structural constraint, because you cannot now grow more than 4% without running into a problem.
Okay, so that's a very important point, and I said previously, Khurram also mentions this. But back to Dr. Nabi. Dr. Nabi, your quick impression of what Dr. Miftah Ismail said, and then I would also want you to tell us why the government is so reluctant in going to the IMF.
Okay, look, Dr. Miftah Ismail has the technical skills, but when he spoke just now, he had this political hat on. I don't think the problem is to assess one speech or one announcement here or there. The problem, as I said earlier and as Surveil has pointed out, is much deeper. Mr. Ismail's government passed it on to PTI, and Mr. Ismail's government received it from PPP, and so on and so forth. So it's this particular package, it'll please some people, it'll not please others, and that's the problem with such packages. You can never satisfy everybody.
That's the problem with social sciences to begin with.
Right.
Some people will be relieved and others will not be.
So it's a political judgment, I'm sure a lot of thinking went into the design of the package to see who will benefit, who will lose out. And in the calculus of PTI government, the net benefit was probably larger. Now, of course, you can always poke holes in any such package. But let's go back to the question that you asked. Look, there are two things that we have to do. In the short run, we have to stabilize. In the past, short-run stabilization has come at the expense of restructuring of the economy, because we have tended to particularly levy taxes, which have been counterproductive as far as our objective of international competitiveness is concerned, because FBR, because of other institutional weaknesses, etc., has found it easier to raise additional revenue by increasing duties on imports. When you increase duties on imports, now of course some of it is paid by consumers, but a lot of it is paid by firms that use inputs to export. So you're increasing their costs. And when you increase their costs, they become uncompetitive. So that's been the traditional pattern. Stabilization has resulted in taking measures that have resulted in making our industry uncompetitive in the international market. I hope what is being attempted now is to address both stabilization as well as competitiveness in one go. And that's going to be much tougher. You've got to raise revenues in the short run to bring down the fiscal deficit, which will then bring down the current account deficit and improve your balance of payments situation. But it's being done without hurting manufacturers who import raw material and machinery, etc., for export purposes. And that's going to be a very tricky balance. In this budget, they've taken the first step in that direction. They've provided lots of provisions for exporters, but at the same time, they've tried to make it very revenue neutral, so that there are enough taxes to pay for some of the losses that will be incurred in the short run on the budget. Now, this is what should and needs to be done, regardless of whether we go to the IMF or not. What will determine in the end is whether we can adequate enough resources, external financing, so that we can take these measures without recourse to the fund. My guess is that it'll be very difficult. IMF exists because there are no other alternatives. Soon those alternatives are exhausted, in which case you need to go back to the IMF. The institution has been created precisely for these situations. Countries run into severe balance of payments crises.
Emergency ward.
And they know how to respond to those crises. I'm sorry?
I said emergency ward.
It's an emergency ward. It's an emergency ward, and sometimes what happens in the emergency wards is difficult, it's painful. The medicine is bitter, the surgery is painful. And the institution will be the first one to tell you, yes, we are that kind of an emergency ward. Yes, it'll hurt. And yes, blame us. Many countries turn to the fund so that they can blame someone.
Right. I'm afraid that's all the time I have for this segment. Thank you so much, Dr. Ijaz Nabi. Very grateful, Savel Hussain, for your views. And of course, from this discussion, it's quite obvious that if we do not do those structural reforms, then with this cycle will necessarily lead us to another cycle, and we will once again be looking at the IMF and the entry into the emergency ward. We'll come back after this break and talk about India and Pakistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. India continues to shun Pakistan's overtures for peace, not only to resume the bilateral dialogue under the framework that was agreed upon in 2014, but also with reference to Pakistan's initiative on Kartarpur corridor. Delhi has shunned Islamabad's invitation to its delegation to discuss the modalities of the Kartarpur framework, proposing instead that Pakistan should send its delegation to India. To discuss this, we have with us Mr. Sartaj Azizi, former Foreign and Finance Minister of Pakistan. Thank you so much, Mr. Aziz. Let's begin with, I will try and take you back to the bigger issue of bilateral relations, but let's kick off with this Kartarpur corridor thing where we took the initiative and the Indians reluctantly agreed to it because obviously they cannot really afford to not look at the sentiments of their own Sikh population. What should Islamabad do now? Because clearly there is a politics around this which Delhi is playing.
Absolutely right. I think Pakistan's offer to open a corridor to enable Indian Sikhs to visit Gurdwara Kartar Sahib, particularly in time for the 550th anniversary of Guru Nanak Sahib in November this year, was announced, and therefore last Monday, I think 21st, Pakistan sent a draft agreement to invite Indian delegation to negotiate and finalize. And there are not sort of very major issues involved. There is the question of timing of the opening, security procedure, and also the issue of ID cards and how they'll be issued. So it was a straightforward kind of draft agreement, and Pakistan felt that this offer and initiative was viewed by all those who wanted India-Pakistan relation to improve a good positive step. But obviously, India-Pakistan relation, which have been under some kind of a deep freeze ever since Prime Minister Modi was elected, are again sort of seeing obstacles in the way. And as you said, India has said, we won't come, but you come here. And this, I think, is because of the timeline of November, this is not a very positive response, which everybody expected to start, at least that even if the big things are not happening, on people-to-people issues, these soft issues, some progress should be made. So now, looking at it from what to do, I think Pakistan should accept one of the two dates in February or March, but instead of either Delhi or Islamabad, propose that these negotiations should be held in Kartar Sahib Darbar itself, which is on the border between India and Pakistan. And there they will also have the opportunity not just to look at the draft agreement, but also examine the situation for double crossing points on the spot, also examine other physical and administrative facilities that will be provided. So that way, I think India will also find that this is a more practical proposal, and visiting the border itself for the Indian delegation should not create any problems. So this might be a good initiative for Pakistan to counter the Indian sort of counter invitation.
That's a very interesting thought, Mr. Aziz. Are you suggesting that, one, it's going to obviously break the logjam. It's neither going to be Delhi nor it's going to be Islamabad. But it also, I sense that, it also sort of places Kartarpur Sahib at the center of things, and it is in fact in the center of things as far as the sentiments, religious sentiments, and other sentiments of the Sikh communities on both sides of the border are concerned.
And when the announcement was, two Indian ministers did come here at this very location and participated in the ceremony.
Correct.
So I think now, if this proposal is accepted on the dates that India has proposed, so we concede the dates that they suitable to them, but they should then accept a neutral avenue, which is Darbar Kartar Sahib.
Well, when you were the foreign minister, you dealt with the current external affairs minister of India, Ms. Sushma Swaraj. After the Kartarpur, this thing, she said that, well, we are not going to conflate this with the bilateral framework. Now, that bilateral framework was agreed upon while you were the foreign minister. Can you just walk us through how that actually came through, and then what happened in order for it to sort of go awry once again?
But you see, we had, of course, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif met Manmohan Singh in September 2013 when he went to the General Assembly. Yeah. And at that time they agreed on improving the trade relation between the two countries. So a draft trade agreement was prepared. Commerce Minister Khurram Dastagir actually went to Delhi. It was almost finalized by February.
Yes.
And we received February 2014, when we received informal suggestion that instead of signing this agreement now, it should wait for the elections, which were 2-3 months away, May 2014. After that, it should be signed. And so we agreed. This looked like a reasonable proposal. because it would should not affect the election outcome. And then, of course, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif went to Modi's inauguration on, I think, 26th of May 2014, and that improved the atmosphere. But suddenly, some incidents happened in Kashmir.
No, but did that improve the atmosphere, Mr. Aziz? Because if you might recall that there was bad blood created by Delhi on the issue of the Hurriyat leaders coming to the High Commission, and then there was, as far as the Pakistani side was concerned, there was also an expectation of a joint presser, which never happened. So I don't think the atmosphere was improved.
No, I think basically what it was that they obviously have been objecting to Hurriyat leaders, and they came to meet me. And again in November later that year, these were things that they were showing their reservations about. But the process was continuing until some incidents happened, and we again tried to resume this process the following year in December 2015, when we were having the Heart of Asia in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And at that time, I think 10 days before, on 30th of November in 2015, Mr. Modi met Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in Paris at the time of the climate agreement, and said how he was under pressure for not talking. So I presume it was a tactical rather than a strategic initiative.
But then after that Paris meeting, if I remember correctly, there was also a back channel meeting between the NSAs in Bangkok.
No,
and
that's what he said.
Yeah.
Prime Minister Modi said, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif said, if we want to move, let Maharaj come to the Heart of Asia meeting on the 9th of December to Islamabad. He said, yes, she can come provided the two NSAs meet before that.
Correct.
And he agreed, and they met in Bangkok on the 6th of December, and then Sushma Swaraj came here on the 9th of December, and we signed a document calling for the resumption of dialogue. And then 3 weeks later, Prime Minister Modi came to Lahore on the occasion of Nawaz Sharif's birthday, went to Jati Umrah, and so at that time things again looked like some kind of dialogue will start. But then Pathankot happened on the first 10 days later, on the 1st of January, and since then the whole thing has been in deep freeze.
Okay. That was Mr. Sartaj Aziz, former finance and foreign minister, giving us his view of India-Pakistan relations. But he also had a very interesting proposal that Pakistan should accept one of the two dates, either Feb or March, and then proposed that the meeting should be held in Kartarpur, which I think is a very interesting proposal, and Pakistan, Islamabad should look into it. We also have with us Gowhar Geelani, who's a journalist based in Srinagar. Welcome, Mr. Geelani, to the program. Give us a sense of the state of relations between India and Pakistan at this point in time, considering that India is in the run-up to the national elections under a right-wing government, and all the signs are that at least before the elections, nothing substantive is likely to happen between India and Pakistan. And at the same time, where you based, we were doing programs on the situation in Kashmir, which is getting worse every day. So just give us a sense of what you think is happening.
Since the ascendancy of Mr. Narendra Modi to government in New Delhi, and you know the history track record of Bharatiya Janata Party being a right-wing party, it has been averse to any kind of dialogue, not only with Pakistan, but also with the so-called pro-India or mainstream political parties in Jammu and Kashmir, or on a daily basis in prime-time television channels. All the anchors are shouting like anything and describing even Mehbooba Mufti or Umar Abdullah as pro-Pakistan, chief ministers. So that is the state of affairs as far as Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. But on a larger platform, you know how the foreign secretary level talks have been suspended only on the pretext that Hurriyat had a meeting with Pakistan Pakistan's High Commissioner based in New Delhi. So that happened a couple of times. So right now there is no little hope as far as this government is concerned, headed by Mr. Narendra Modi. There is this policy of belligerence, and in their own words, like India's National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, describes this policy as a policy of 4 Ds, which is denial, defeat, and all sorts of things, that they don't want any dialogue with Pakistan unless in their lexicon that unless Pakistan stops any kind of violence and terrorism from its soil. But even in Kashmir, there is loss of body. People receive body bags of their young, fragile fathers, old fathers bury their children on a daily basis, and there is no political initiative. In the absence of any meaningful political initiative, Kashmiris have been suffering the most. And this has been, last year, 2018, has been the worst year in terms of violence for a decade. Such levels of violence have been witnessed 10 years ago. But now this daily cycle of violence and the absence of any civilian government also, which has been the Kashmiri face of the Indian government in Kashmir, is also not there. So right now, one man, Mr. Satyapal Malik, the governor, is running the show in Kashmir. That's how things are right at the moment.
Gowhar Geelani, yeah, absolutely, you're absolutely right. But here's the thing: this whole thing has been sort of reduced to India-Pakistan relations and quote-unquote Pakistani terrorism. Even though as far as Kashmir is concerned, it is primarily about the right to self-determination, which is a peremptory norm and therefore is an inalienable norm. And so leaving Pakistan aside, I've been asking this from our Indian analysts, what exactly is Delhi trying to do in and with Kashmir? And I don't think I've received any plausible response to that up until now.
See, the problem with Delhi is, when a Kashmiri, for example, votes in elections, so only then it is considered that Kashmiri has, made a choice on his or her own. If a Kashmiri asks about his political rights, his and her political, economic, and human rights, then it is being dubbed as he or she is being dubbed as a Pakistani agent. So such is the state of affairs. Even when the UN, an institution of UN's caliber, issued a damning report in which it accused New Delhi and Indian armed forces of torture, rape, extrajudicial killings in Kashmir, using excessive force to suppress dissent. Even that report was not welcomed. It was seen as something motivated and a facade. So such is, as far as Delhi is concerned, it is denial about Kashmir, that there does not exist any dissent. So they have used all tactics, media, all the strategies of the media, 21 strategies, which Noam Chomsky lists in his phenomenal work. All those strategies have been used to deny the political, economic, and human aspirations that are there in Kashmir for the last 70 years. So right now, Delhi wants to telegraph a message, and the message is that Delhi will not bend, and Delhi will use all kind of force to suppress the dissent in Kashmir. And it's not, I'm not talking about the Hurriyat conference. I'm not talking about the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front. I'm not talking about the men
street.
with
You're talking
guns.
about the street. I understand
I'm talking
that.
about the street sentiment.
Absolutely. Gowhar Geelani, hold that thought. I also have Anando Bhakto, a journalist based in Delhi, with me. Welcome to the program. Earlier, I was talking to our former Foreign Minister, Mr. Sartaj Azizi, with reference to the Kartarpur Sahib corridor, and the fact that, after Pakistan's invitation to the Indian delegation, Delhi got back and said, well, we are going to host it in Delhi and you choose one of the 2 dates, either Feb or March. Mr. Aziz said the only way to break that logjam would be for Islamabad to actually suggest that let's have this meeting neither in Islamabad nor in Delhi, but in Kartarpur Sahib. What do you think of that kind of proposal?
Well, first of all, we have to understand the current political climate in India. Now, in the past 4.5 years of Mr. Narendra Modi's government, who heads the right-wing BJP coalition at the center, the discourse really has been on the Hindu identity, the Hindutva politics, the Hindu supremacy. We have seen our domestic, the domestic climate also deteriorate in the sense that there have been mob lynchings, and the mob lynchers have found support from some elements in the ruling, belonging to the ruling dispensation. Now, all of that has taken the public mood to a situation where any any overtures to Pakistan or any dialogue with the Hurriyat camp in Kashmir will really not be seen in a very good light back home. And this climate has been created, and the Congress party, which traditionally has not been so extreme in its policies, they have also been facing a kind of existential crisis in terms of electoral politics, and which is why they have also tilted towards majoritarian discourse and majoritarian agendas. Now, in this situation, it is really not, conceivable that India will immediately make overtures to Pakistan or agree to talk. And the home.
But
politics,
I was talking
really
specifically. I perfectly understand what you're saying. I mean, that is the sentiment that I get from India, especially by people who have a secular approach to issues, who want to have inclusive politics. But I was specifically talking about Kartarpur Sahib in the sense that that's something which is, from a religious and emotional perspective and historical perspective also, very sacred to the Sikh communities on the Pakistani side also and on the Indian side also. And so Delhi is obviously playing politics with that also by saying, well, we are not going to come to Pakistan, but we offer you 2 dates. You send the delegation to Delhi. And as I mentioned to you, I was talking on this program with our former finance and foreign minister, Mr. Sartaj Azizi. And Mr. Sartaj Azizi gave an interesting proposal that Islamabad should propose that let's not have this either in Delhi or in Islamabad, but let's have this meeting in Kartarpur Sahib. So I want to know if you think that's a sensible proposal that can actually counter the kind of politics that Delhi is playing with this issue.
Well, overall, I believe that we can never change our geography. We can never change our neighbors. So when there is a problem at the border, we two countries do need to talk. But I address that point in the larger political context in India. At this point, the politicians, be it from the BJP or from the opposition Congress, they really do not have the mandate of the people to kind of extend such such kind of gestures towards Pakistan. For example, if you remember that Navjot Singh Sidhu, our Congress politician from Punjab, he attended Mr. Imran Khan's swearing-in ceremony.
That's where it all began.
Yes, and he hugged the army chief, but he was slapped with a sedition case back in India. And it also found support when you go by the social media trends and the kind of discourses on social media. You see that there is a general support to, kind of that kind of aversion to Pakistan and engagement with Pakistan is really very dominant at present. So,
I agree with you.
These are also the times of the general election. So I don't think that
absolutely. So there's also the politics of that. Anando Bhakto, thank you so much for talking to us. Before I wrap up, let me just go back to Gowhar Geelani in Srinagar. Mr. Geelani, what Bhakto said, and I think that's something that most Indian analysts and those that I get on my program basically say the same thing. In that, it's fairly clear to me that the situation is only going to get worse before it gets better, if at all. But give me a sense of, very quickly, because I've left with very little time, about the kind of right-wing Hindutva groundswell in Indian mainland itself, the kind of threat it has for the minorities, not just for the Muslims, but minorities across the board.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not only about the 21% Muslims or 20% Muslims. It's also about the marginalized, dispossessed, disempowered sections, which include Dalits, for example, and other disempowered sections, which are not so-called Brahmin class, who do not belong to the upper class Hindus. So they are also feeling sidelined, marginalized. But at the same time, there is a constituency in mainland India also, which is trying to counter now the BJP narrative or the RSS narrative. And that's why you have seen in the recent elections in Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Rajasthan, the BJP has lost elections. So if that trend continues, which is very difficult to predict, because you don't know what kind of plan B the BJP has when it comes closer to elections. So right now they say in Urdu they need a guy, Pakistan and Musalman to win elections, and also Kashmir, of course. So right now you see the rhetoric will go up. And you don't know what kind of, BJP has this, as Anando was mentioning, it has a civilizational idea about Muslims. It has a civilizational idea about Kashmir and Pakistan. So that kind of a Hindutva project, unless it is not challenged at multiple levels by parties like Congress, by CPIM and other leftists and Indian liberals, which I'm sorry to say, as Parry Anderson would say, there are no liberals in India. So it's very difficult to predict how things will go. But let's hope.
Absolutely. Gowhar Geelani, thank you so much. This is all we have for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.